The rain was pouring relentlessly that spring afternoon. The sky, once blue and serene, had turned into a dark blanket, with heavy clouds stretching across the horizon, releasing their burden without mercy. In the small town of Evergreen, nestled between hills and forests, the sound of water hitting the roof was a constant reminder that something worse was coming. In the heart of this modest town lived Mr. Benjamin, an elderly man known to everyone as Ben. He had been widowed for many years and lived alone in an old house, built by his father decades ago. Ben had a peaceful routine. Every morning, he walked to the nearby lake, where he spent hours sitting on his old wooden bench, watching nature. That spot connected him to his late wife, Maria, who loved spending afternoons there, gazing at the sunset. The lake was a piece of his past that he carried with him, a place of peace in the midst of his loneliness. But on that day, as Ben looked out the window, something different unsettled him. The rain didn't seem ordinary. The lake, usually calm and peaceful, now looked menacing, with the waters rising rapidly. The streets began to transform into small rivers, and the tranquility Ben always felt started to give way to a sense of danger. "It's just another storm," he muttered to himself, trying to convince himself there was no need to worry. But as the hours passed, he realized this storm was unlike any he had ever seen. The water began creeping into his property, climbing the steps of the porch. Ben decided to act. He was a stubborn man, proud of his independence, even at his advanced age. He walked with difficulty to the back door, where he kept some tools, hoping to find something that could help him divert the water invading his home. However, when he opened the door, he realized it was too late. Water had surrounded the house on all sides, and the sound of nearby streams growing louder signaled that the situation was far from improving. Evergreen was not prepared for such a sudden flood. The streets were deserted, and the few people still trying to resist the water were trapped in their own homes, cut off from the outside world. Ben, without a phone and with no close neighbors, was completely isolated. He tried to stay calm, but the reality was unforgiving. The water was rising, and he had nowhere to go. With tired legs and labored breathing, Ben sat at the door, watching the water approach. He thought of his wife Maria, of how she would calm him at this moment, saying everything would be fine. But Maria wasn't there, and the house that had once been his refuge now felt like a trap. As Ben lost himself in thought, something caught his attention. In the middle of the current now flooding his yard, he saw something moving. A small figure, which at first appeared to be just a branch carried by the water, showed signs of life. It was a beaver. It swam against the current with surprising agility, dodging obstacles and making its way toward Ben's house. The old man was intrigued. Beavers were common in the area, but he had never seen one so close to his home. What was this animal doing here, in the middle of a flood? Ben watched it curiously, momentarily distracted from the fear he was feeling. The beaver, seemingly determined, swam with strength, as if it had a specific destination in mind. When the animal finally reached the porch, Ben stood up with difficulty and moved closer to the edge to get a better look. The beaver looked directly at him, its eyes shining with a kind of understanding. There was something in that gaze that calmed Ben's heart, as if the small animal was there for a bigger reason. It seemed to know what it was doing. Without knowing exactly why, Ben bent down and extended his hand, as if to touch the animal. The beaver didn't flinch. On the contrary, it stayed put, staring at the old man with a calmness Ben didn't expect from a wild creature. For a few moments, time seemed to stop, and Ben felt less alone. But that moment of peace was interrupted when a stronger wave hit the house, causing water to flood the lower floor. Ben knew he had to act, and fast. The beaver, however, didn't move. It seemed to be waiting for something. Then Ben realized the animal was looking fixedly at a point behind the house, where a small natural dam had formed over the years, built by the beavers in the nearby area. In that instant, something clicked in Ben's mind. That beaver was there for a reason. It wasn't just swimming by chance. The animal wanted to show him something, to guide him somehow. Without thinking twice, Ben decided to follow the beaver, believing that this small creature might be his only chance of escaping the flood. As the water continued to rise, Ben opened the back door and, with difficulty, began walking toward the place the beaver was pointing to. With each step, the current grew stronger, and Ben struggled to keep his balance. The beaver, on the other hand, swam ahead of him like a silent guide, leading him away from the approaching danger. Ben followed the beaver with hesitant steps, feeling the cold water rising higher on his tired legs. The current was growing stronger by the minute, and he knew that if he didn't move quickly, he'd be completely submerged. The sound of the flood around him was deafening, the roar of water invading the land, the cracking of branches being swept away, and the wind howling like a desperate warning. But despite the chaos surrounding him, Ben clung to the small creature ahead of him, which seemed like his only hope of survival. The beaver, agile and determined, didn't waver from its course. It swam with impressive precision, always checking to see if Ben was still following. The old man struggled to keep pace, his lungs burning with the effort, his legs weakening with every step he took. For a moment, he thought about giving up. The weight of his age and the fear of not being able to escape were crushing him like an avalanche. He thought of Maria, of the promise he made to himself to keep going, even after she was gone. But now, faced with the uncontrollable force of nature, even his fighting spirit seemed ready to surrender. The water reached Ben's waist, and he felt the icy current penetrate his bones. He looked around, and the landscape he knew so well had vanished. The lake had completely overflowed, and what was once a green field was now a turbulent sea of murky, raging waters. He thought of his neighbors, of the houses around him, and wondered how many people were facing the same terror. But there was no time for more reflection. Every second counted, and the beaver continued its journey as if it knew exactly where it was headed. As they moved forward, Ben noticed that the water level was rising even faster. His house was almost completely submerged now, and he knew there was no going back. But where was the beaver leading him? He had never ventured this far into the forest. The only thing he knew was that this creature seemed to have a destination in mind, and he, with no other alternatives, followed it with faith. Then, suddenly, Ben stumbled. His already fatigued feet couldn't resist the force of the water, and he fell hard, being swallowed by the current. The shock of the fall made him swallow water, and for a moment, panic overtook him completely. He fought to get back to the surface, his arms flailing against the relentless strength of the flood. His eyes filled with tears of fear, and he thought this was the end. But in that moment of despair, something unexpected happened. He felt a gentle tug on his sleeve. The beaver, who had previously seemed distant and indifferent to his suffering, was now beside him, using its sharp teeth to pull him back to the surface. With surprising effort for such a small creature, the beaver guided Ben to a shallower area where he finally managed to stand, coughing and gasping for air. Ben stood still for a few moments, trying to catch his breath and understand what had just happened. The beaver, as if it were nothing, continued its journey, now moving slower, waiting for Ben to follow. It was as though the small animal had made a conscious choice to save him. As Ben composed himself, he looked around and realized they were approaching a group of fallen trees, piled on top of each other, forming a natural barrier. The beaver climbed nimbly over the logs, stopping at the top to wait for Ben. This was where it wanted to take him. But why? What was special about this place? Ben, still struggling, climbed the logs, his trembling hands searching for support. When he finally reached the top, he looked to the other side and saw something he never expected. There, on the other side of the barrier, was a small clearing, a sort of natural shelter protected from the floodwaters. The flood hadn't reached this spot yet, and the elevated terrain seemed safe for now. The beaver, with its calm gaze, looked at Ben again as if to say, "Here, you'll be safe." Ben, still in disbelief, collapsed onto the dry ground of the clearing, exhausted but relieved. He could hardly believe he had survived the journey. What had started as a simple rainy day had turned into a fight for survival, and he was alive thanks to a beaver. A small animal that, somehow, seemed to understand his situation and acted accordingly. As the wind continued to blow and the floodwaters raged in the distance, Ben closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to breathe. But he knew this wasn't the end. He was safe for now, but the flood still threatened. And even though he had found shelter, he couldn't stay there forever. He would need to find a way out of the forest, to return to the safety of the town, or what was left of it. The beaver, as if understanding Ben's thoughts, stayed nearby, watching him. It was as though the small animal was ready to guide Ben to the end of this journey. There was an inexplicable connection between them now, something that went beyond logical understanding. Ben knew he wasn't alone. Ben sat for a moment, trying to catch his breath and calm his racing heart. The makeshift shelter between the trees seemed safe, but he knew he couldn't stay there forever. The sound of the flood still echoed in the distance, a relentless reminder of the danger. He needed to find a way out of the forest and get to a safer place. As he pondered his next move, the beaver started to move again, this time more slowly, but with the same determination. Ben looked at the small animal, now more of a guide than just an observer. Something inside Ben urged him to trust the beaver, even though it defied all logic. With no clear alternatives, he decided to follow it once more. Carefully, Ben climbed down from the barrier of logs and followed the beaver through the clearing. The water hadn't reached this area yet, but the ominous sky suggested it wouldn't be long before the storm brought more trouble. They walked in silence for a while, the sound of water and wind dominating the atmosphere. As they pressed on, Ben's mind began to drift back to everything that had happened. The flood wasn't just a natural event. It seemed to have stirred up a flood of memories and emotions he had tried to bury over the years. He thought of Maria, of how she would always know how to calm him in moments of distress, and how much he missed her in situations like this. His heart ached as he recalled all the moments they had shared, the dreams they had, and the things they never got to do together. But as these thoughts crowded his mind, something unexpected happened. The beaver suddenly stopped at the edge of a small hill. It looked out over the horizon, and Ben followed its gaze. In the distance, something caught his attention. There was a small cabin, partially hidden among the trees, perched on a slight elevation. It was an old structure, but it seemed sturdy enough to withstand the storm. Ben felt a wave of hope. "That's where he's taking me," Ben murmured, almost not believing it. The beaver seemed to know the way to safety. The walk to the cabin wasn't easy. The ground was muddy, and each step felt like a monumental effort for Ben. He knew his strength was fading, but the sight of the cabin gave him the motivation to keep going. The beaver, as always, stayed ahead, making sure Ben could keep up without falling too far behind. When they finally reached the cabin, Ben felt relieved, but something made him uneasy. The door was slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. With a mix of caution and hope, he carefully pushed the door open and stepped inside. Inside, the cabin was simple but welcoming. There was a fireplace, a few wooden chairs, and a makeshift bed in the corner. Someone had definitely been living there, but there were no signs of recent activity. For Ben, however, that didn't matter at the moment. The most important thing was that he was safe, protected from the storm still raging outside. He sat down in one of the chairs, exhausted but grateful to have found shelter. The beaver, who had been so determined and agile until now, seemed to finally relax. It settled down beside the fireplace, as if it knew its mission was nearly complete. Ben looked at the small animal with admiration. "You saved me," Ben said softly, knowing the beaver couldn't understand his words, but feeling that somehow there was a connection between them that went beyond language. For a moment, everything was quiet. The sound of the storm outside seemed distant now, muffled by the cabin's walls. Ben closed his eyes and took a deep breath, allowing himself to feel a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. But that peace was interrupted by an unexpected sound, a faint groan coming from a dark corner of the cabin. Ben immediately stood up, alarmed. He looked around, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. That's when he saw a figure huddled under a blanket, trembling from the cold. It was a young woman, likely in her 20s. Her face was pale, and her half-open eyes showed deep weakness. She had a fever and clearly needed help. Ben approached cautiously. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. The young woman slowly opened her eyes and tried to speak, but her words were weak and indistinguishable. Ben knelt beside her, trying to comfort her. "I'll help you stay calm." He quickly looked for something to warm her up. The fireplace was out, so Ben stood up and began searching the cabin for firewood. Thankfully, he found a small stash of dry wood in a nearby cupboard. He lit the fireplace, and soon enough, the warmth began to fill the room, pushing away the cold that had taken over the place. The young woman started to recover slightly, but she was still too weak to speak. Ben, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, knew that he needed to find medical help as soon as possible. But how? The flood had isolated the area, and he wasn't sure if there was any rescue available nearby. Plus, his own physical condition was far from ideal. As he weighed his options, he glanced again at the beaver, who was sitting quietly by the fireplace, watching everything unfold. There was something about the animal's posture that conveyed confidence. Ben knew that somehow this beaver had already led him here. Maybe it could do more. Then, an unexpected idea popped into his mind. He didn't know if it was rational, but something inside him told him he should trust the beaver's instincts. With a deep sigh, Ben stood up and said, "I need to trust you once more, my friend." He opened the cabin door and looked at the scene outside. The beaver glanced at him, as if it knew another mission was about to begin. The wind still howled, shaking the trees and flinging rain against the cabin windows, but Ben knew he didn't have time to waste. He looked at the young woman, now breathing more steadily thanks to the warmth of the fire, but still dangerously weak. Her fever hadn't broken, and Ben knew that if he didn't find help soon, she might not survive. The beaver, as attentive as ever, waited by the door as if it knew what needed to be done. Ben felt a connection with the animal that defied explanation. He knew the beaver had led him to safety for a reason, and now it was time to trust it once again. "You brought me here, and now we need an even bigger miracle," Ben murmured as he tightened his coat around his body and checked the surroundings one last time. There were no medical supplies, and the floodwaters were still roaring outside. The situation seemed desperate, but Ben knew he couldn't just sit back and do nothing. He opened the cabin door, and the beaver quickly headed outside, glancing back as if to ensure Ben was following. Ben braced himself against the cold wind and followed the beaver down the muddy trail. The forest was in chaos. Fallen trees, mud everywhere, and the deafening sound of rushing water made it feel like the world was collapsing around them. As they trudged through the thick mud, Ben started to notice something strange. The beaver wasn't just swimming aimlessly. It was leading Ben along a very specific path, taking the highest possible ground, as if it knew exactly where to go. Ben tried to recall any landmarks in the forest, but the storm and his exhaustion had left him disoriented. Still, he followed, hoping the small creature had a plan. After about half an hour, fatigue began to take over. Ben's muscles ached, and each step felt like an enormous effort. He was close to giving up when a distant sound caught his attention. It was mechanical, a hum, an engine. At first, Ben thought it was his imagination, but as they moved closer, the sound became clearer. It was real. The beaver, as if hearing the same noise, quickened its pace, and Ben struggled to keep up. Minutes later, they emerged from the dense forest onto a dirt road. On the other side of the road was a military truck, clearly part of a rescue operation. A group of men stood near the vehicle, scanning the area, looking for anyone who might need help. Ben, his heart racing with hope, began waving his arms frantically, shouting with all the strength he had left. "Here! Over here!" His voice, hoarse and exhausted, nearly drowned in the storm's roar, but one of the soldiers spotted him. Quickly, two men rushed over to him. When they reached Ben, they supported him as he explained the situation. "There's a woman in the cabin. She's very weak, running a high fever. We need to get her to a hospital." Without hesitation, the soldiers grabbed their gear and followed Ben and the beaver back along the path they had taken. When they arrived at the cabin, the young woman was still lying by the fireplace, her skin pale but her eyes now open. One of the soldiers quickly examined her, his face showing concern. "She needs medical attention immediately," he said. "Let's get her back to the truck. We've got a doctor on standby." Carefully, the soldiers lifted the woman onto a makeshift stretcher and carried her through the muddy trail to the waiting truck, where a medic began administering first aid. Ben, now completely exhausted, sat on the ground, watching as the rescue unfolded. He could hardly believe that, after everything, they had made it. The woman was safe. The beaver, as silent as ever, stayed by Ben's side, watching the scene as if it had been waiting for this moment. Ben looked at the small animal with a gratitude he couldn't put into words. "You did this," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You brought us here." As the soldiers prepared the truck to drive the woman to a hospital, one of the officers approached Ben. "We need to get you out of here too, sir. It's not safe to stay." Ben nodded, but before he climbed into the truck, he looked one last time at the beaver. The small creature stood at the edge of the road, watching everything unfold with its sharp, observant eyes. Ben approached and knelt beside it, unsure of what to say. The beaver looked back at him, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the animal understood everything that had happened. "I don't know why you did what you did, but I'm forever grateful," Ben said, tears welling up in his eyes. He never thought a creature so small could have such an impact on his life. But there he was, alive and well, all thanks to the bravery of a beaver. Before getting into the truck, Ben gave the beaver one last respectful nod. The beaver, as if acknowledging the gesture, gave a slight bob of its head and, without fanfare, turned and disappeared back into the forest, leaving Ben with a memory of a miracle he would never forget. As the truck rumbled along the muddy road, leaving behind the isolated cabin and the dense forest, Ben sat quietly, watching the landscape blur through the rain-streaked window. The sound of the engine was comforting, but his mind was still replaying the events of the past few hours. He glanced at the young woman, now lying safely beside him in the truck, with the medic checking her vital signs. She was going to be okay, thanks to the beaver, the unlikely hero that appeared when all seemed lost. What surprised Ben most wasn't the fact that he'd been saved, but the way life had unexpectedly placed him in a situation where the courage and instinct of a simple animal had made all the difference. He had spent much of his life searching for meaning, especially after losing Maria, but never imagined he'd find hope and salvation in the actions of a beaver. As the truck moved along the bumpy road, his thoughts drifted back to the days when he and Maria used to walk together to the lake, watching the wildlife around them. Maria always said there was a special connection between humans and nature, something many people ignored. Ben never paid much attention to it, until now. Now, he saw the world differently. It wasn't just humans who shared emotional bonds or demonstrated empathy and compassion. He had witnessed the love for life in a creature that many would consider insignificant, a beaver who, in the middle of chaos and danger, had led him to safety and given him another chance. The young woman beside Ben began to stir, slowly opening her eyes. She was still weak, but conscious enough to realize she was safe. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to speak. Ben leaned in closer, offering her a gentle smile. "It's okay now," he said softly. "You're safe. We found help." She looked at him with tired but grateful eyes and managed to whisper, "Thank you. You saved me." Ben shook his head, still smiling. "It wasn't me. It was a special friend who brought us here." She frowned slightly, not understanding what he meant, but before she could ask, the truck came to a stop. They had reached the rescue point, where a larger team was waiting to transfer the survivors to a hospital. Ben and the young woman were carefully helped out of the truck, and he watched as she was quickly taken to an ambulance. Before being loaded into the ambulance, she gave Ben one last weak but sincere smile. He waved back, knowing that although their lives had crossed at a moment of desperation, the true protagonist of the story had disappeared into the forest. As Ben waited for his own medical check, he looked up at the sky. The rain was finally starting to ease. The heavy gray clouds were beginning to part, allowing small rays of sunlight to break through, signaling that the storm was slowly subsiding. At that moment, a deep sense of calm washed over him. He felt a wave of gratitude, not just for surviving, but for everything he had learned in such a short time. Life is full of mysteries and challenges, and often the greatest miracles come from the most unexpected places. Ben reflected on how, even at his advanced age, there was still so much to learn about the world and about himself. He had been saved by a creature many people would overlook, but to him now, it represented something far greater: the power of nature, the instinct to protect, and the silent strength that connects all living things. He remembered Maria's words, that nature has its own way of taking care of those who respect and listen to it. And that day, he felt he had listened to nature in a way he never had before. The paramedics approached and helped Ben into a chair to check his vital signs. He, now calmer, nodded in appreciation, but his mind was still elsewhere. He knew this experience would stay with him forever. In the days that followed, Ben was treated at the hospital and soon returned home. The small town of Evergreen was still recovering from the damage caused by the flood, but life was beginning to return to normal. Everyone in town knew the story of Ben and the beaver that had saved him, and people looked at him with admiration and respect, but Ben never made a big deal out of it. To him, what had happened was a quiet reminder that life, in all its forms, has value and purpose. That afternoon, Ben did what he always did. He took a walk to the lake. Sitting on the old wooden bench he and Maria used to share, Ben gazed at the water, now calm and serene. He closed his eyes, breathing in the fresh air, feeling the tranquility he cherished so much. At that moment, he knew he would never truly be alone again. When he opened his eyes, he saw something in the distance, between the trees. A small beaver, watching him from afar, as if just making sure his old friend was okay. Ben smiled and gave a small wave before the beaver disappeared back into the forest. That day, Ben understood that miracles can happen anywhere, even in the darkest moments. And sometimes, they come in the most unexpected forms, like a small beaver that appears in the midst of a flood, changing everything and leaving a lasting mark. Final reflection: Ben and the beaver's story isn't just about survival. It's about hope, about believing that even in the hardest times, there is something or someone who will stand by our side, guiding us, even when we don't understand it right away. Life has mysterious ways, and if we keep our eyes and hearts open, we'll see that help can come from where we least expect it.